Hello and welcome to a revision session looking at 1625 to 46 in England. Was the king the main cause of instability? Well, when looking at the question, was Charles I the main cause of political instability, 1625 to 46, I would argue that Charles I is not the main cause of instability. In fact, it is more likely that Parliament was a more significant cause of this instability, as well as religion and war and the Duke of Buckingham during this period. So it's definitely true that Charles I did cause some tensions and political instabilities between himself and Parliament in the period 1625 to 46. For example, he followed some unpopular policies, such as the use of his prerogative right to raise forest fines from 1634 onwards, sale of knighthoods for about £30, and the use of monopolies. For example, we know the use of monopolies was particularly unpopular, since in 1640 Parliament expelled all monopolists from the House of Commons. Additionally, the use of ship money, another use of his prerogative right to raise funds without using Parliament, was incredibly unpopular, which we can see from the case of John Hampden in 1637, when although judges backed the king in saying that John Hampden should go to prison for not paying ship money, only 7 out of the 12 judges actually supported the king, showing that 5 of them had supported John Hampden and therefore didn't fully accept the king's methods of raising taxation. These things prove that the king was partially a cause of political instability, since he wasn't being fully supported in his financial policies by those around him, such as judges. However, there is a limitation to how far he was responsible for this political instability, since it's also true that using things such as the Treaty of Madrid in 1630, he managed to save the finances of the country by saving around £430,000 per year. And although his use of forest fines, monopolies and sale of knighthoods and ship money was unpopular, again this helped to rebalance the books to the point where the country was in a better financial position than it had been under James I. Additionally, it's true that whilst Charles I turned to personal rule, ruling without Parliament for 11 years from 1629, he never had to actually use the army to enforce this personal rule, which suggests that there's a limitation in arguing that there was an element of political instability at this time. It was clear that the king was in control, he followed the law, and he had rights within the law at this time to rule without Parliament, and not having to use the army suggested that there wasn't a massive rebellion against this at the time. However, again, there were events which prove that Charles I was definitely partially, if not as significantly, to blame as Parliament, since it was actions such as the case of the 5 Knights in 1627 which highlighted the king's inability to publicly deal with questions about his methods of rulership, since the king denied the right of habeas corpus of the 5 Knights to publicly explain the reasons for their arrest. And additionally, Charles I made poor decisions in reacting to Parliament in 1642 when he was unable to arrest the 5 MPs and to close Parliament due to the Triennial Act. Charles I fled London, and by doing this he reinforced Parliament's attempts to cause political instability in 1642, because by fleeing London he left the House of Commons in a position where they could claim that the king was going to gather military forces against them, and it gave them the authority in some way to publish a document called the 19 Propositions, where they started to redefine Parliament's role and cause political instability by suggesting things such as their right to approve who advised the king, and also their right to control troops and to control the army, which was a major trigger for war. So therefore, whilst Charles I wasn't a main cause of political instability, he was an underlying cause, enabling Parliament to take actions which undermined the political system. So Parliament was a greater cause and perhaps even the main cause of political instability 1625 to 46. For example, from 1625, at the beginning of Charles I's reign, they had refused to grant tonnage and poundage for life to the king, which meant that it would enforce Charles to call Parliament on a regular basis in order to ask for extra subsidies. Tonnage and poundage had been granted to all previous kings and monarchs of England. By not granting Charles I this right to tonnage and poundage, they were causing political instability as they were trying to enforce greater rights and freedoms for Parliament by making the king call Parliament more often. And their actions, such as publishing the document of the Petition of Right in 1628, which argued against taxes and troops and martial law which were being used during the wars with Spain and France, suggesting they were unpopular, which led to great tension between the king and Parliament. However, these aren't as significant in evidence of their cause of political instability as other events, such as a small group of radicals called Pym's Junto. Now, Pym's Junto were responsible for undermining the relationship between the king and Parliament to the point where there was a civil war between them in 1642. For example, Pym's Junto were responsible for impeaching individuals such as Laud and Strafford, who'd both been personal advisors to the king. Additionally, when there had actually been a potential for resolution between Charles I and Parliament, where political instability could have been ended and the two parties could have ended up working together, when Buckingham died in 1628, a small group of radicals refused to leave Parliament in 1629 when the king dissolved Parliament, and thereby damaged the relationship once again between the two groups. Additionally, and perhaps more significantly, the 19 propositions, as previously mentioned, were published by Parliament in June 1642, which include anti-Catholic legislation, Parliament to approve all members of the Privy Council and control troops. And by publishing this document, Parliament were defining their new role and causing political instability. Moreover, the Triennial Act of 1641 also was an opportunity that the Parliament used to try and redefine their role and take more power by forcing the king to call Parliament once every 3 years and preventing him from ever dissolving Parliament, stating that it had to be Parliament itself that dissolved Parliament. It had to be done by their consent. These actions of the 19 propositions in the Triennial Act of 1641 and 1642 massively undermined the king's prerogative rights. Moreover, it was individuals such as John Pym spreading rumours about the Irish Rebellion being a Catholic plot, and rumours about Henrietta Maria being impeached for being a Catholic in 1642, that further deteriorated relationships between the king and Parliament, because this action of spreading these rumours was a trigger for the king sending members of the armed forces to arrest MPs, which triggered the war between the two groups. In this way, Parliament was a more significant cause of political instability 1625 to 46, because their actions weren't only unpopular, they were also long-lasting and had a greater impact on the relationship between Charles I and Parliament, since they fundamentally undermined the rights of the king. However, Charles I and Parliament are not the only causes of political instability 1625 to 46. Religion also played a significant role in the political instability that existed at this time. For example, the appointment of William Laud as the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633 caused tensions within the country about religious policies, since William Laud was an Armenian, which was seen as being similar in some ways to Catholicism and was therefore unpopular. We can see how unpopular he was because he was impeached by Parliament as an evil counsellor in 1640, for encouraging ceremony and ritual and hierarchy within the church, which was something that was incredibly unpopular. So we can clearly see that religion was a contentious issue, and one which would have caused political instability. Additionally, and perhaps more significantly, the first and second bishops' wars in Scotland also highlight that political instability was caused, or at least triggered, by religious issues. Charles I's implementation of the English prayer book in Scotland in 1637 went fairly unsuccessfully, and he ended up having to send the Earl of Strafford, also known as Thomas Wentworth, up to Scotland to try and deal with this issue. The Second Bishops' War was incredibly unsuccessful for the Earl of Strafford, and unfortunately ended with the Treaty of Ripon, where he was defeated, and he ended up having to concede that the king would have to pay £850 per day to the Scots. The Treaty of Ripon, a bit of a rip-off for the king, that's one way to remember it, because they were claiming the money for the troops that they'd had to spend in fighting against the king. So it caused real political instability because it caused further financial pressures for the king, and it was an issue in which Parliament and the king found very difficult to agree upon. The king dealt with the issue himself, and therefore not being the main cause of political instability, relatively well, since he enabled Parliament to go through with impeaching the Earl of Strafford as an evil counsellor for his misjudgments and for his lack of planning and bad dealership with the Second Bishops' War, and he enabled them to go through not only with the impeachment of Strafford, but finding him guilty of treason and his execution as well. And it offered an opportunity for Charles to reconcile with Parliament in some way. However, it was issues of religion which kept coming back up. For example, we can see this with the Irish Rebellion in 1641, 1 year later. Although the king had made efforts to try and smooth things over with Parliament, again the issue of religion rises up. When the Irish rebelled in October 1641, it was suggested that this was a Catholic plot and that therefore the king must be potentially secretly trying to support the Catholics in taking over Scotland for themselves. And additionally, we've got within the 19 propositions of 1642, there were anti-Catholic clauses showing that it was religion which was causing tension. Furthermore, we can see that with the Scots and the Puritans in the armies in 1642 to 1646 during the Civil War, there were clear hopes for religious reform. For example, the Newcastle Propositions of 1646 contained clauses saying things like that they would suspend bishops and not have them anymore within the church. And the Scots had agreed to aid the Parliament in the Civil War during the Solemn Leaving Covenant on the basis of some religious reforms that would go ahead for them if they took part. So these things all show that religion was an ongoing tension and something which was causing political instability, as it meant people were wanting to ask for further reforms than they had before. For example, with the Irish Rebellion of 1641, it led to the Grand Remonstrance being written up by Pym's Junto, which was a list of all the things that the king had done wrong, and it led to also the Irish Rebellion in 1641 led to Parliament calling an army for themselves, which is significant because previously only the king had ever called an army, and they did this because the king was still in Scotland at the time, and they claimed they needed something to be done to deal with the issue. So in some small way you could say Charles I was partly to blame for this. However, it was religion that was the underlying issue that was really causing the tension between the two groups. In this way, it can clearly be seen that religion is also a greater cause of political instability 1625 to 46 than Charles I, since it was a more underlying issue and one which kept triggering other tensions to re-arise, whereas Charles I was actually dealing relatively well with the threats as they arose. War was another particularly significant cause of political instability 1625 to 46. In fact, war was a greater cause of political instability than religion. The battles of the Civil War were extended over a 4-year period, but there was about one battle per year. So, for example, Edge Hill, Newbury, Marston Moor, Naseby, all of them spread across the country as well. So the front line was very long. There were troops in the battles and troops guarding towns and trying to take over particular provinces. So this had a real impact on the political stability of the country, as in different areas of the country, different groups had control, and therefore in different areas of the country there were different laws. For example, Parliament's army gained a reputation for starting to seize supplies, and Parliament started to introduce martial laws. In other areas of the country, the king was ruling under his pretences. Additionally, the creation of the new model army in 1645, and also Scotland's allegiance with a solemn leaving covenant, bringing an extra 23,000 extra troops in 1643. All of these things helped to extend the period of the Civil War, which was a period when there was no clear rulership of the country, and therefore there was great instability in the country. Additionally, there were newspapers being published by each side. So Parliament had 6 of their own newspapers, Royalists had 2 of their own newspapers, publishing propaganda against one another. And all of these things are causing political instability. It's not clear who's in charge, and they're trying to undermine one another. In this way, war itself had a greater impact on the political landscape of the country than religion. Religion triggered some tensions between the two groups, but it was war itself which massively undermined the politics of the two groups. And of course, it led to the capture of the king in 1646 and attempts to completely reform the rights of the king and the powers of the king and of Parliament. In this way, war was a more significant cause of political instability than Charles I as well, since war had a greater impact on the political landscape of the country than Charles I's unpopular policies. Finally, the Duke of Buckingham. The Duke of Buckingham is a fairly insignificant cause of political instability, 1625 to 46. Although it's true that his actions, so for example sending the Viscount of Wimbledon to lead an attack on Cadiz and his role in the attacks on La Rochelle were particularly unsuccessful and very costly for the country and did lead to some tensions between Charles I and Parliament. He was only around for the first 3 years of Charles I's reign, assassinated in 1628, and he wasn't replaced as the favourite of the king. Other councillors certainly did avoid scandal in the 1630s, and in that way perhaps the Duke of Buckingham was more of a cause than other members of the Privy Council of political instability in the form of tension between Charles I and Parliament. But in reality, his role was very limited in this period and only led to tensions which were given the opportunity to resolve after his assassination in 1628. Overall, I would argue that Parliament is the most significant cause of political instability, 1625 to 46, since it was their actions of passing the Petition of Right, the Triennial Act and the 19 Propositions, which fundamentally undermined the King's position of power and his royal prerogative rights. And it's that which led to war, 1642 to 46, and it was war which undermined the political landscape of the nation for 4 years and had a greater impact on the political landscape than Charles I himself. Charles I, therefore, although he caused tensions between himself and Parliament by following unpopular financial policies and using personal rule, was a less significant factor, as he had less of an impact on the political landscape than Parliament and war. So, true or false? Was religion a greater cause of tension than Parliament? Did the Solemn League and Covenant help to extend a period of political instability? were the Triennial Act, Grand Remonstrance, and 19 Propositions example of Charles I's policies that caused political instability? That's the end of this podcast. Good luck with your essay planning, and good luck with your revision. Some excellent books which I've used to create this podcast and also can be used and I would advise for using for revision include Malcolm Chandler's 1C Britain 1625 to 1701 London Revision Notes Pack, and pages 1 to 12 being the ones that I've used to create this podcast, and Bullock, Nuttall and White's fantastic book Revolutions in Early Modern and Modern Europe, which is created or published by Pearson, 2015 edition as well. Pages 13 to 24 were used for this podcast, both of which I would highly recommend for your revision. Good luck with your revision.